Welcome to our lecture on Introduction to Wisdom Literature. We've been talking about poetry, and wisdom literature is, like the Proverbs, definitely poetry, but wisdom literature can be expanded in its form as far as how it's dealt with. There can be narrative stories and other things. But let's start with an introduction to the wisdom words in the Old Testament. As far as terms, there's a couple of Hebrew terms that are used in the discussion of wisdom. One is understanding, and that's the Hebrew term being, and it's to understand or perceive. Derivatives of this are perception, insight, that sort of thing. But there's another word that is more representative of the typical Hebrew discussion of wisdom, and that is the term hakam or hokmah, which is wise or to be wise. The verb hakam, again, the same root, to be wise, occurs 26 times in the Hebrew Old Testament. The adjective wise or wise person, 135 times, again, based on that word. The abstract noun wisdom, based on hokmah, occurs 147 times. So it's just a plethora of times in the Old Testament as far as its presence. The dimensions of the semantic range of hokmah, or wisdom, have 4 different levels. First, it's basically a skill in a craft. In other words, you've got some technical skill of an artisan, that sort of thing. And Exodus 35 talks about that. Every skillful man among you, let him come and make all that the Lord has commanded in the building of the tabernacle. The one gentleman who God has called, Uri, the son of Hur, he has wisdom and understanding and knowledge in all craftsmanship. And this is the idea of what's going on here. So skill in a craft is one level of understanding wisdom. Wisdom in this sense is used of warriors, sailors, farmers, priests, all sorts of different roles, judges, counselors. Then there's the level of hokmah, wisdom, which is talking about intelligence, the semantic range of shrewdness or intelligence. So an academic wisdom or scheming or cunning in planning type of wisdom. 1 Kings 4 presents Solomon as a master of hokmah or academic wisdom. Job 39 presents one who is opposite of this type of person. Then the scheming or cunning type of ideas in 1 Kings 2, where Pharaoh's plot to get rid of the Exodus 1, Pharaoh getting rid of the Hebrew children, that scheming or cunning type of wisdom. And David's advice to Solomon to plot the death of Joab in 1 Kings 2 is what I was trying to get at, the scheming, cunning type of wisdom. Then there's a sense of hokmah that is moral understanding, or some just good common sense. Good moral understanding. The ability to apply knowledge, in other words. Prudence. Proverbs 6:6-8. Go to the ant, O sluggard. Observe her ways and be wise. Proverbs 1:5. A wise man will hear and increase in learning. Man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. So prudence or moral understanding is knowledge that works. Putting knowledge into action. That brings also a success to the endeavors that are undertaken. And then there's another level to wisdom that is the understanding of the fundamental issues of life. Wisdom is, or hokmah is, this also sort of understanding of the fundamental issues. And in this range of understanding of hokmah, it's recognizing the essence of wisdom is theological, number one. So it's characterized by the fear of Yahweh. Job 28:12-29:1. But where can wisdom be found, and where is the place of understanding? He goes on and on about that. But wisdom is found with the Lord. Second of this type of understanding the fundamental issues of life, this type of semantic range of hokmah or wisdom, is the recognizing the nature and purposes of the difficulties in life. In other words, suffering. We talked about that in our first discussion board. Also, in this sort of sense of understanding wisdom, it's recognizing the reason for existence. Why are we here? So wisdom can be defined then as the quest for self-understanding, somewhat, in terms of relationship with things, people, and our Creator. This search for wisdom, then, this higher level of wisdom or semantic range of wisdom, occurs on three levels. There is natural wisdom, which is an attempt to master things for our survival, our benefit, how things work. This includes drawing up studies of nature, natural phenomenon, how they relate to man and the universe. This is sort of the how nature works and sort of MacGyver. How can you use it for your benefit as far as how things go together and that sort of thing. How to create a bomb out of for MacGyver, out of a paperclip and some chewing gum, something like that. Then there is this other type of wisdom that's just judicial or practical wisdom, with the focus on human relationships. How do we deal with each other? We have an ordered society and state, and how do we interact? And so that type of wisdom. Then there is a theological wisdom, which moves in the realm of, again, theodicy. Why do bad things happen? Evil, that sort of thing. How does it come about? But this, and this affirms that God is the ultimate meaning, so He is the beginning and end of all things. Some distinctives of Hebrew wisdom literature is that there really never was a wisdom movement in the sense of, I'm going to go to university in the Old Testament. If I were an Old Testament person, I'm going to go to scribe wisdom school and become a sage. They didn't have that type of profession. Now, there were counselors who did this as a profession, but it's not like you could get a degree in it and there's a class and a whole lot of these people around. Now, there was a class. There were men who did this. They were sages. They acted this way. They used wisdom, but it wasn't such a movement where everybody's out there doing it, or there's a big portion of or professional society for it. But it is taking place. So there is an office of sage or wise man. It's mentioned David had his counselors, and Jeremiah 18:18 talks about these sorts of things. There are several officials talked about in the Old Testament. Prophet, priest, king, judge, and leader. And then there is this idea of a sage, of one who's the wise counselor, to like Ahithophel, that sort of thing. And the sage was supposed to give counsel on how to prudently live, how to make good decisions, and make sure that you have good counsel to stand up against anything that comes your way. And Ahithophel, it was said of him in 2 Samuel 16, the advice of Ahithophel, which he gave in those days, was as if one inquired of the word of God. So was all the advice of Ahithophel regarded by David and Absalom. So he was the wisest of all of David's counselors. And then there's Hushai the Archite, and there are others as well. Now, a wise person in the ancient Near East, and these Hebrew wise men, would assume several things. One is that the universe is ordered. In other words, creation is an ordered creation, and life proceeds according to a fixed order. And this order is also teachable and learnable. Now, if we learn that order in the universe, we're given an instrument with which we can determine and secure our way successfully and have a prosperous life. And the fourth assumption is the source and foundation of the order in the universe is God himself. So, the universe is ordered, number one. The order is teachable and learnable, number two. Learning that order can give us an instrument or guide to success or prosper us. And fourth, the source and foundation of that order is God. God created all and and how we interact and everything. So these are the assumptions of the wise person. Now, their methods, the method of the wise person, the wise person will stand back and just observe life, observe animals, observe the ants. Solomon was able to do this. He did it very well. He talks about the ants. He talks about different creatures and how they live and how they act. And there are character traits about them that if we learn those character traits, then we can be successful also. And so that's the idea of looking at the universal, how God created and how these things work, and then take those principles and apply them to our own lives so that we can be successful. So it is somewhat secular in its viewpoint. It's just looking at the natural order for the most part, though that is tied into the view that it's God that is behind all of this natural order, of course. And it does have a significant motto that's focused on God, and that is the fear of the Lord is the first principle of wisdom, and that fools despise wisdom and discipline or knowledge. So it's God-centered. It begins with God. It's God's order, and and the beginning of wisdom really starts with the fear of Him, and that we should respond rightly to Him. And there are all sorts of other basic themes within wisdom literature, again, as far as life and how to live and interact with people and things and God. But again, to sum up, the source of information for the wise person is the world that's out there. The scope is universal. The wisdom writings don't address Israel directly, though they do reference Yahweh, God. But they deal with issues that are common to everyone. And so they are, again, universal. The emphasis in wisdom writings is on the personal, practical well-being of the individual. Very, very little is said about the institutional religion of the Israelites and that sort of thing. But the audience is the individual. Some themes of Hebrew wisdom literature. One, the divinely ordained order of the universe, as I mentioned. God created it. Proverbs 8 talks about this. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of His way. Before His works of old, from everlasting, I was established. From the beginning, the earliest of times of the earth, when there were no depths, I was brought forth. So wisdom is speaking personified. Second theme, the ambiguity of events and the meaning of life. Again, while you may recognize the principle of order in the universe, it's not always that easy to see the order played out. So there's a tension between the fear of God, the knowledge of God, Job being God's servant, and yet having to deal with suffering. And so there's a tension somewhat, but there is a plan, there is an order, and it's God's order. And we go back to Romans 8, all things work together for good, those who love Him, called according to His purpose. There's also in Hebrew wisdom the correlation between human behavior on the one hand and punishment and reward on the other. Back to Job. There is this idea of the retribution principle that is in Hebrew wisdom literature and in ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature. That is, that if you act rightly, then you'll be blessed. If you act wickedly, then you will be cursed and experience sin, death, evil, and poverty. And that's the retribution principle. And then, if you see someone who's blessed, they must be righteous. If you see someone who's poor and sick, then they must be unrighteous. That's the takeaway that Job's friends came away with, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture. But that correlation between human behavior and punishment and reward is called the retribution principle, and it doesn't always play out. Again, back to the ambiguity of events in life, because God has purposes that are greater. But in general, that idea is true, and in the eternal, we will be with God, and while we may go through some suffering here, in the long term, all those promises that are in Proverbs that we perhaps can't expect today to come about, in the long term they will, though we may have suffering to go through for God's purposes. There is also this theme of the supreme value of life. And life is defined in wisdom literature as a long existence, good health, and a lot of friends, children, good reputation, possessions, wisdom, and all of these sorts of things. Proverbs 3, 9 through 18 talks about these sorts of things. There's also the theme of the reliability of wisdom. While wisdom is difficult to acquire and find, Job 28, its acquisition is open to all, and when it's found, it's a guide to life. Very nicely, we're told that if we ask for wisdom from God, He will give it to us, and so that's a great promise for us that He'll give this wisdom to us. But it is reliable in the ancient Near East, and this is the understanding in Hebrew. And also, the understanding is there is this idea of the personification of wisdom, also folly at times. But this theme in Hebrew wisdom begins in Proverbs in 1, 3, 8, and 9, but really comes up in the wisdom of Solomon when in Ecclesiastes he talks about, in Proverbs 1, 20 through 33, wisdom shouts in the street, she lifts her voice in the square, the head of the noisy streets, wisdom cries out. So he's talking about wisdom personified. And this idea that wisdom is personified is a common theme in Hebrew wisdom. Now, as far as the literary forms of wisdom in Hebrew, there are proverbs, simple sayings. A proverb is short, pithy statements that give common sense. Genesis 10:9, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. So an epithet or pithy statement, that's what that is. But Proverbs, poor is he who works with a negligent hand, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. That's a short, pithy statement. That is a simple saying. There are also numerical sayings in Proverbs. There are 6 things which the Lord hates. Yes, 7 which are an abomination to Him. They count and list items, and these reflect concern for order and completeness. By the sage, he's saying that there is an order and there is a completeness to what's going on. There is another issue or a feature, wisdom feature called an autobiographical style. The wise person's perceptions are presented in the first person as personal discoveries. I passed the field of the sluggard, and by the vineyard of man lacking sense, and behold, it was completely overgrown. So he's saying, look, the wise person saying, look, I walked by the sluggard, I saw this. I saw him act this way. And so that is a characteristic feature within the wisdom literature of Hebrew. There are also in Hebrew wisdom literature long teaching poems, didactic poems. First, Proverbs 1, 8 through 19. Hear, my son, your father's instruction. Do not forsake your mother's teaching. Indeed, they are graceful. Wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. So he's teaching, but it's a long poem that's going through different items that he wants to teach. There are beatitude-type poems in wisdom. Blessed is the man who finds wisdom. For her profit is better than the profit of silver, and her gain better than fine gold. So that sort of thing, that's Proverbs 3, 13 and following. There are dialogues, wisdom dialogues, where you have speeches back and forth, and Job is an example of this sort of thing. You have his friends and him back and forth about this retribution principle and why he is in the situation he's in. There are fables in wisdom literature. 2 Samuel 12, 1 and following. Nathan says to David, there was 2 men in the city, one rich or poor. Rich man had a great many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except this little ewe lamb. And so this is the whole issue of the Bathsheba, and he's giving this fable to David to let David realize that he has done great sin, grievous sin. And so that's a wisdom fable. Then there are also allegories. Now, allegories involve stories or descriptions in which the individual elements stand for something else. Now, there's one in Ecclesiastes 12 that's very nice. Remember also the day of your Creator in the days of your youth before the evil days come. Evil days meaning old age. This is allegory. The years draw near when you will say, I have no delight in them, before the sun and the light and the watchman and the moon and the stars are darkened. Eyesight goes, and clouds return after the rain. Aches and pains linger. In the day that watchmen of the house tremble, unsteady, weak arms and hands when you get old. The mighty men stoop, a humped back when you're old. The doors of the street are shut. The sinking of lips as the teeth fall out. As the sound of the grinding mill is low, again, the loss of molars, being able to chew. One will arise at the sound of the bird, inability to sleep. So he's got this allegory of old age going on, but he doesn't say it directly. So it makes it interesting, and this is in the wisdom of Solomon in Ecclesiastes. And there's teaching narratives. Of course, narratives are there to instruct and teach. That are teaching narratives that are dealt with within wisdom, the first part of Job, that sort of thing. Now, Hebrew wisdom literature is involved in this idea of wisdom in the ancient world. Okay, there is wisdom out there. There's Egyptian wisdom literature and there's Assyrian wisdom literature. They're all doing the same thing. They're all looking at how do we interact with people, how do we interact with the world, what can I learn from ants, what can I learn from animals, what can I learn from different plants, and these sorts of things. So they're looking at universal things. So even though those ancient peoples might not have been Yahweh worshipers, they don't realize that God is the beginning of all wisdom. They still can find things, universal truths within the world as they're observing. So there is international wisdom. 1 Kings 4 talks about the wise men of the east in Egypt came to Solomon. They thought he was the most wise and that sort of thing. Hebrew wisdom literature is very similar in content because of this to ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature, but again, not in perspective. Egyptian perspective is social relationships. Everything is about how do I deal with everybody else, whereas the Hebrew perspective is how do I deal mainly with God, and He's in control of everything, and then how I deal with everyone else. Egyptian wisdom literature was well known. The same forms occasionally appear in Egyptian and Hebrew wisdom. The statements on subjects were grouped into books. The teacher was called the father. The student, the child. The student was called upon to memorize the sayings of the teacher. These things are common in ancient Near Eastern wisdom, as they are in Hebrew, these sorts of things, because the process was the same. Hebrew wisdom, however, uses antithetical statements, the wise versus fool, righteous versus wicked, all of this sort of thing where they're contrasting because they have a standard of righteousness. They have a standard of relationship to God that the ancient Near East didn't have. And so they didn't use, the ancient Near Eastern wisdom didn't use this sort of statement. Again, the issue of a righteous sufferer, how or why a righteous person would suffer was still also a concern in the ancient Near East and their wisdom. So the righteous prosper, the wicked suffer, yet a prosperous man a righteous man can be in poverty or sickness. How do we deal with that? So that was a theme of ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature as well. Well, we're going to be using this sort of category as we talk about Job and Proverbs as we move on. So we'll see you next time.